I'm very glad we're having this conversation today. Sadly, it couldn't be more timely, and I want to thank all the organisers for putting it together, especially Jonathan, Ophir. It's also a special pleasure for me, even in this horrible moment, to speak alongside Hoya. We've been corresponding about these issues for some years now. And after the meeting, if you want to read an excellent long overview which really dives deep into a lot of the issues that we'll be talking about today in Danish, he's written an excellent essay in, I guess, the latest issue of Eftertryk, which I can warmly recommend. So we're meeting nearly a year in now to Israel's destruction of the Gaza Strip, which it has all but accomplished. Very possibly on the precipice of an even more devastating regional war. Over the past 12 months, the preeminent political and judicial institutions of the international community have repeatedly condemned Israel's onslaught. So, for example, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, he testified that, quote, "The level of suffering we're witnessing in Gaza is unprecedented in my mandate. I've never seen such a level of death and destruction." The European Union's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, publicly affirmed that Israel was using starvation as a weapon of war in Gaza. The chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, he applied for arrest warrants to be issued against Israel's Prime Minister and Israel's Defense Minister on suspicion of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Independent Commission of Inquiry, appointed by the UN Human Rights Council, found that Israel had intentionally caused, quote, "the near total destruction of civilian objects in Gaza," that Israel's attack was, quote, "directed against the civilian population as a whole," and that Israel had committed in Gaza, quote, "the crime against humanity of extermination." And the International Court of Justice, the supreme judicial organ of the United Nations, found in January of this year that Israel was plausibly committing the crime of crimes, genocide. More broadly, in July, the court found that Israel is committing the international crime of apartheid in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and that Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, which means all of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, its presence there is illegal. So, in short, Israel's conduct has received wall-to-wall condemnation, and in the most grave terms, from the most respected pillars of the international community. Now, Israel's response was to accuse these political and judicial authorities, the UN, the EU, the ICC, the ICJ, of anti-Semitism. So you have this fellow named Israel Katz, he's the foreign minister of Israel. He denounced the United Nations under Secretary General Guterres as an anti-Semitic and anti-Israel body. The same official, the Foreign Minister of Israel, denounced Josep Borrell of the EU as, quote, "an anti-Semite and Israel hater." Israel's Finance Minister, Bezalel Smotrich, accused the International Court of Justice of spreading, quote, "Nazi propaganda." And Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, he ranked the chief prosecutor of the ICC among the great anti-Semites in modern times, like the UN and the EU and so on, charging that his application for Netanyahu's arrest amounted to, quote, "the new anti-Semitism." Well, these attempts to insulate Israel from critical scrutiny by demonizing Israel's critics as anti-Semitic, they're by no means a new phenomenon, but they have drawn support and succor in recent years from something called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, working definition of anti-Semitism. Now this IHRA definition, as it's known, it's become pretty influential, although it's also very controversial. Many European governments have, in some sense, in some way or another, endorsed some variant of this text, including Denmark. It's also referenced in the anti-Semitism policy of the European Commission, and many private entities, from universities to political parties to social media platforms, have incorporated the definition in their codes of conduct, and they are constantly prevailed upon to then use the definition to regulate what can be said and what can't be said in those spaces, to censor speech. I want to use my opening remarks tonight to provide a brief overview of this thing called the IHRA definition, how it came to be, what's wrong with it, and why anyone genuinely concerned with fighting anti-Semitism and defending human rights more broadly should steer well clear of it and the ideas that it expresses. I'm going to make 3 basic points about the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. Number 1, it's not IHRA's. Number 2, it doesn't work. Indeed, it barely qualifies as a definition. Number 3, it's got nothing to do with fighting anti-Semitism. So, let's start with the claims made by the supporters of this definition. More on them later. That the definition is both effective and indispensable for fighting anti-Semitism. Is that claim true, or even remotely plausible? It first merits noting that no evidence has ever been presented of any kind ever that adopting any anti-Semitism definition, let alone this one, has been effective in reducing anti-Semitism. Just no evidence has been presented. Katharina von Stern-Weiner, the European Commissioner, who's been a big promoter of this text, she keeps saying it's evidence-based. She's yet to provide any of that evidence. Furthermore, organisations responsible for monitoring and fighting anti-Semitism, they've repeatedly over the years declined or been very reluctant to use the definition, which would be odd if it was effective and indispensable for their task. To give one revealing example, which we only know about because of Freedom of Information documents acquired by an Israeli journalist called Itai Mashiach, when the German government was considering whether to issue some kind of statement recognizing the IHRA definition in 2017, internally they asked all of their actual technical experts from other departments who are responsible for fighting anti-Semitism whether this was a good idea. And the assessment of those internal experts was that the IHRA definition was at best useless and unnecessary, and at worst actively counterproductive. And those departments only agreed to the Cabinet's eventual recognition of the definition when the wording was watered down, so that it would be purely symbolic. Originally the wording said applying the definition, and it ended up being like noting the definition. So they were like, okay, this won't mean anything, we can get on with the serious work, fine. Not what you'd expect if, indeed, the definition is indispensable for fighting anti-Semitism. Now let's look at the IHRA text itself. I've never seen it blown up so big, it looks even worse now. Well, for any definition of anti-Semitism to be successful, what's the criteria? It has to be clear, has to be concrete, and has to be capable of being applied consistently. The whole point of it is, you know, if you look at a statement or an action and want to know if it's anti-Semitic, and you apply this definition to find the answer, and I do the same, we're going to reach the same verdict, because we both have this clear, consistent, common benchmark to refer to. That's the point of it. Does the IHRA definition meet these requirements, or, on the contrary, is it vague and ideologically loaded? Well, the definition itself, which is on the screen, it comprises just 2 sentences. The key bit is highlighted. It reads like this. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Okay. I think it doesn't take a rocket science to spot the problem there. To say that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews It doesn't clarify what kind of perception that is. And to say that anti-Semitism may be expressed as hatred towards Jews leaves open that it may be expressed in any number of other ways. Maybe love of Jews, maybe indifference towards Jews. It hardly rules out anything. So in other words, this so-called indispensable critical anti-Semitism definition, it's not just vague, it verges on being meaningless, literally. Now there's a second element that often accompanies or is appended to the IRA definition. And that's a list of 11 illustrative examples. 11 examples of potentially anti-Semitic speech. Now notice I said potentially anti-Semitic speech. That's because the text states that those examples could, taking into account the overall context, constitute anti-Semitism. Again, I don't think we need to disturb our busy friend the rocket scientist to see the problem. Any statement theoretically could be an example of anti-Semitism. It all depends, as the IRA text says, on the overall context. So the obvious question then is, what sort of overall context would be considered qualifying? Alas, the IRA text says nothing at all about this. It doesn't say anything about what context should qualify as rendering a statement anti-Semitic. Finally, let's look at these 11 examples of possible anti-Semitic speech. 4 of the 11 refer to statements about Israel. Kind of funny in an anti-Semitism definition. For reasons of, 7 make reference to Israel, but 4 are about kind of speech about Israel directly. For reasons of time, let's just look at the most obviously problematic of these. Applying double standards by requiring of Israel a behaviour not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. Let's set aside for now the questionable assertion smuggled into this supposedly neutral expert definition of anti-Semitism that Israel is a democratic nation, even as it has refused to extend political rights to millions of Palestinians under its rule. The question remains, who's guilty of these double standards? It's clearly completely in the eye of the beholder and dependent on your view of many controversial questions at the heart of the Israel-Palestine conflict. According to Israel and its supporters, for example, everyone from Amnesty International to Human Rights Watch to the European Union to the United Nations to the International Criminal Court to the International Court of Justice, they're guilty of treating Israel with double standards. Recall again that the whole point of a definition is to be clear, unambiguous, and not politically loaded, so it can fulfill its function of reducing the scope for interpretive disagreement on the part of different people. So including as a criterion of anti-Semitic speech something like applying double standards to Israel, it doesn't just fall short of the requirements of a good definition, it completely negates them, makes a mockery of them, as it requires that any anti-Semitism investigator, and the claim is that this is meant for police on the street who arrive to a crime scene and have to quickly decide, is this incident anti-Semitic or not? They've first got to take a position on Zionism, the occupation, the whole Israel-Palestine conflict to decide, have double standards been applied. So, just to recap our Talmudic exegesis, this so important IRA definition, without which it's just impossible to combat anti-Semitism, would be totally lost without its text. In fact, it's the international, global, universal gold standard for understanding what anti-Semitism is. Well, what does this sacred text tell us? It says anti-Semitism is some kind of a perception of Jews, but it doesn't say what kind. Then there's a list of examples that say that some kinds of speech about Israel could, depending on the context, be anti-Semitic, but it doesn't tell us in what context. And then some of the examples, they include criteria whose application cannot but be wildly subjective and therefore wide open to political bias. And furthermore, this is all very clear to anyone who just reads the text. And I think that's worth pointing out because I can't tell you how many disquisitions and treatises and tracts have been written either defending or analysing this text, analysing every letter of every word. And it's just a completely idiotic document which anyone can see by giving it a moment's thought. I once wrote that never before have so many written so much about something so manifestly absurd. And that's something to bear in mind the next time you see some official adopting a grave tone, pretending to take anti-Semitism seriously, and then presenting you with this verbal porridge as if it was the answer. They're just insulting your intelligence, and they're playing politics with Jewish safety into the bargain. Well, this just raises the obvious question: if the IRA text is so stupid, why all the fuss? Why has so much energy been expended to promote it on the one hand, and why are people like us bothering to object to it? And that brings us to my second point. It's not really IRA's definition. It's Israel's definition of anti-Semitism. I earlier quoted Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu construing any arrest warrant issued against him by the ICC as comprising the new anti-Semitism. That choice of epithet by him is quite instructive. Israel and certain pro-Israel groups have promoted this notion of a new anti-Semitism all the way back since the early 1970s. It's not really about anti-Semitism, it's also not new. It started when Israel first came under pressure to withdraw from occupied Arab territory in the early 1970s in exchange for peace, and in particular with Egypt. The basic idea of the new anti-Semitism claim is that much or most international criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism in disguise, whereas classical anti-Semitism targets Jews as individuals or communities. The new anti-Semitism targets the Jewish state as a more politically correct outlet for that same age-old, unchanging animus. A former Israeli minister, who was also the head of the Jewish Agency for a long time, Natan Sharansky, he helpfully summarized the insights of this genre in 2004 in a formulation he called the 3 Ds. When Israel was delegitimized, when it's demonized, and when double standards, our old friend double standards, were applied to it, here Sharansky said was the new anti-Semitism at work. Now, I think the political agenda at play here doesn't really need spelling out, any more than it needs spelling out that when a working definition of Islamophobia defines as Islamophobic opposition to Muslim self-determination in Palestine and Kashmir, as there is such a text, that might have something to do with the fact that the drafters of that definition support Palestinian and Kashmiri states. Now, in 2004, against the backdrop of heightened international criticism of Israel during the Second Intifada, a handful of pro-Israel Jewish organizations, led by the American Jewish Committee, they drafted what they called a redefinition of anti-Semitism. Why redefinition? Well, because it included the tenets of the new anti-Semitism. It included Sharansky's 3 Ds. Sharansky later said he was very happy to see that his great invention, the 3 Ds, had been baked into this working definition. Well, that 2004 definition is essentially the same text as the one we now call the IHRA definition. What basically happened is the American Jewish Committee managed through various means to persuade an agency of the European Union, it was called the EUMC, to circulate the Israel lobby's definition as a non-official draft text. Then some pro-Israel groups started to use that text against Palestine solidarity activists. They dragged the EU and the EUMC's name into these efforts. They pretended that this definition was the formal EU definition, the formal European definition, or the formal EUMC definition, which it wasn't. So, embarrassed, the successor organisation of the EUMC, called the Fundamental Rights Agency of the EU, that still exists today, it deleted that definition from its website in 2013. Cue outrage from the Israeli government and pro-Israel organisations. They all met in Jerusalem and they decided we've got to find, this is in 2015, we've got to find a new home for this definition. And they found it in 2016 in this intergovernmental body called the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which up to that point was just a sleepy intergovernmental body that brought together researchers and officials from different European countries to coordinate on Holocaust education, museums and remembrance and that kind of thing. So the key point then is that the so-called IRA definition, it was in fact conceived, drafted and promoted from the start and up to now by pro-Israel lobby groups. The main group responsible in 2004 for the original drafting, as I said, was the American Jewish Committee, the group which engineered the adoption of the definition in 2016 by the IHRA was called the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Both of those organizations engage in reflexive lobbying for Israel and routinely depict legitimate Palestine solidarity activism, as well as accurate criticism of Israel, as anti-Semitic. So the AJC, for example, declared anti-Zionism and the movement to boycott Israel anti-Semitic, and it condemned Amnesty International, the leading human rights organization, as having earned, quote, a place of dishonor in the annals of anti-Semitism. In practical terms, the AJC has promoted Israel's line on every critical international controversy. Even where it disapproves of Israeli policy, the AJC pledged in 2020, we will always be their advocates. The Simon Wiesenthal Center, meanwhile, referred to Israel's pre-June 1967 borders, which is to say its legal borders, as Auschwitz lines, and it likened the European Union guidelines prohibiting funding to institutions which operate in Israel's settlements, which contravene international law. It likened them to the Nazi boycott of the Jews. It also, in 2016, branded a UN Security Council resolution which condemned Israel's settlements, again, as the UN has done for many years, as the world's worst anti-Semitic and anti-Israel incident. So these are the kinds of actors who are behind the so-called IHRA definition. That's who you empower when you recognize, endorse, and use the text. That brings me to my final point. It's got nothing to do with fighting anti-Semitism properly understood. If the so-called IRA working definition of anti-Semitism is manifestly inadequate for defining or combating anti-Semitism, if it was produced and promoted from the start until now by Israel lobby groups, if its text clearly includes examples like applying double standards to Israel, which can and have easily been used to conflate legitimate, accurate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, then it's clear as day that what we're dealing with here, with this IRA definition, it's got nothing to do with fighting anti-Semitism. It's just a vehicle to legitimize and institutionalize the long-standing view of Israel and its organized supporters that virtually any serious criticism of Israel's constitution and or conduct should be automatically dismissed as bigotry.
And Jamie, you were way over time. So
Am I?
yeah, you are. Because it's very interesting. So it's very hard to cut you off. But 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
All right, then I'll leave with one conclusion. I have 3 concluding reflections. I leave with one concluding reflection, which is a more of a tactical one. I think many institutions think they can get away with a purely symbolic recognition of this definition, or like a vague endorsement of it, and thereby they get Israel and its advocates off their back without doing any real harm. And I think the history of the IRA's drafting and promotion to date really cautions strongly against that. What actually happens over and over and over again is basically when the pro-Israel lobby groups first approach an institution and ask them to adopt this definition, they play it down, it's only symbolic, it's got all these caveats, don't worry, it won't threaten free speech and so forth. And then as soon as the institution adopts the text, they drop all of those caveats and they press on, they treat it as a sacred text that has to be enforced harshly and fully against their political opponents. If you want any examples of that, you can ask me in the Q&A. I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.